Hi, and welcome along to another edition of NCBI's podcast. My name is Kevin Kelly. I'm the head of policy and advocacy with NCBI. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Clare Kennelly, who's the CEO of Inclusive Cork. Clare, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm absolutely delighted to be here.
Clare, you're vision impaired yourself. Do you want us to tell us a little about your visual impairment?
Yeah, absolutely. My vision impairment is called Stargardts, and many people describe it as a juvenile form, a younger person's form of macular degeneration. So it impacts my central vision. So things like reading are very difficult for me. So I was initially, I suppose, identified or diagnosed with Stargardts when I was 19, and I was in second year in UCC. And yeah, it was a tough time. I really, excuse the pun, I didn't see it coming. And I actually failed UCC. I failed my second year exams as a result because I didn't look for any support. I, didn't know what to do really. And I left college for 5 years, and I went abroad. I went to the States for a while, and then I went to Spain to teach English as a foreign language. And when I came back to UCC, I repeated second year, finished my degree. I did Spanish and sociology, and I did my HDiP, and I became a teacher. So I'm a vision impaired teacher.
Wow. Well, I think in fairness, failing a year in UCC due to diagnosis of sight loss is much better than, as excuses go, than too much partying. So we'll give you that one, Clare.
Well, Kevin, I did both. I can't blame it all on sight loss. I had a great experience. I had all the student experience as well. So
we all remember those days fondly. But Claire, you said that it was a shock to you when you received the diagnosis. So you didn't struggle when you were at secondary school?
no, I think I was okay in secondary. Like probably I thought I had a bit of myopia, and I was, I had glasses for reading. But it was really, I suppose, when I was in college, what these big, huge lecture theatres are like. And there's a big one in UCC called the Boole. And I was in the Boole lecture theatres. And what I noticed was everyone else could see the overhead projector, but I couldn't. So I knew there was something wrong. And that's when I went for further investigation. Yeah.
Yeah, and what happened when you received the diagnosis in terms of services, both in the college setting and outside of college? Were there many services afforded to you to allow you to adjust to your new reality?
Kevin, we're talking 30 years ago now. This was about 1986. And I believe the DSS, the Disability Support Service, was probably starting around that time, but I certainly knew nothing about it. And I didn't look for any supports in UCC. I wasn't even aware it existed. I remember the ophthalmologist at the time saying, register or go to NCBI. And you know what? I think I went as far as the door of NCBI, and I turned around and left again. So I actually didn't seek the services. And it's not like when you're identified at that time, it wasn't like the services came to you. So we are talking a long time ago. And it took me a long time to seek support for my vision impairment, which now, looking back as an older person, looking at my younger version of me, I'm sad about that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I suppose for people who regularly listen to the NCBI podcast, that's something that other contributors or interviewees have spoken about, and I had a somewhat similar experience myself when I lost my sight, where And it's different for everyone. Some people are ready to embrace the new reality and the new services, but for some people it takes a number of months, and that's why it's so very important to let everyone come to terms with the diagnosis of sight loss in their own time, and not to rush and put pressure on people.
I totally agree. It took me a very long time. I think, I suppose back in the 70s and 80s growing up, I didn't see much disability anyway. You know, it wasn't really in the mainstream school like it is now. Um, you know, I suppose I'm Generation X, and Generation X baby boomer, silent generation. We were in schools when education was segregated, when disability went to what we call, in inverted commas, special schools, special education. Whereas now, I suppose the millennials, you know, the Gen Z, they are experiencing a more inclusive education. So from their very first day in junior infants, they're in school in a mainstream setting with disability, and I think it's much healthier for society. And then it's much healthier as well for if someone acquires a disability later in life, they know that disability is part of the human condition. Whereas for me, it was like I didn't want the identity, and I didn't welcome it. And it took me a long time to come around to accepting the identity that was put on me that I did not ask for.
And if there's anyone listening to the podcast today who has just received a diagnosis of sight loss, looking back, what advice would you give them today?
Okay, there's a lot of support out there, and don't be afraid to ask for help. I think probably one characteristic that I have is I'm very independent, and that can be great in one sense, but in another sense, when you're too independent, you don't want to ask for help. And what I've had to learn through my life is it's okay to ask for help. We all need support at different times of your life, whether it's because of disability, or you're a new parent, or you're starting a new job, or you're learning a new task or a skill. You know, there's, you ask for support, you ask for help. So if somebody has recently been given the diagnosis, you know, the NCBI are there. They're in every, you know, I suppose, province of Ireland. The services are there. But you know, it's an amazing service that NCBI have, and maybe it's not talked about very often, but I've certainly used it. You have, I suppose, a counselling service, and it's done by telephone. And I found that really helpful because I'd receive a call from the counsellor when I needed it. Um, and I didn't have to try and get to an office and sit in front of a person and, you know, spill your guts out. And then, you know, you have to get back on public transport to get home. You got this wonderful phone call from this wonderful person in your own home, in the safety of your home. And they are very knowledgeable about how to support you in a society that isn't necessarily built for us. So I think that's a wonderful service for people. Talk to someone, talk about how you're feeling, because you know what, family and friends are great, but it's great to speak to somebody outside of your family and friends who has an understanding of sight loss.
It certainly is, and our counselling and emotional support service is a service that has been long established, and we hope to grow it, because there is a great need, and it is so very important for our people when they're coming to terms with a diagnosis of sight loss. And it's one point that's related that you mentioned there in your answer is the fact that it was a service that was being provided through the telephone. And if there are any advantages of COVID, I think NCBI, like many organisations, has been forced to embrace technologies and new ways of working, and we've moved a lot of our services online, and there's virtual advocacy groups, book clubs, technology clubs, to name only a few that are happening, and it takes away that whole pressure for people to leave their home and everything that involves in terms of planning and so on, and particularly in rural areas where people can be quite isolated, and I reflect back on my own time growing up in northwest Donegal, where you simply didn't have the public transport links to access services, and that really is a barrier. So the whole area of online and virtual is really very important, and I would encourage as many people listening to the podcast as possible to reach out and to engage with those services.
Kevin, I totally echo that. That is so true. Being reliant on public transport is a barrier because so many of us live in rural Ireland, and then you need, even if you're getting public transport, like you might need someone to give you a lift to the bus stop, like from where you're living, or to pick you up again at a certain time. So you're always relying on other people. And with the inclement weather in Ireland, waiting at bus stops isn't always, very nice if there isn't a shelter. So you're standing there in the rain. And for some people who are using guide dogs as well, it's a lot of work for the dog, taking long trips and getting back home again in one day. So I really have embraced the remote working and the technology. And I really believe that technology is the game changer for all disability, not just sight loss, but it is a huge opportunity for us with sight loss.
Certainly is, Claire. And if we won't go back to your days in UCC to learn all about your partying habits and get top tips for any vision impaired students who are starting their college career. But after college, you worked in kind of teaching and training roles, and I think that probably that learning from that space has kind of shaped your current role as CEO of Inclusive Cork. So what was the world of work like for you?
I loved teaching. I actually had never planned on being a teacher. It was very funny because when I was a young girl growing up, my parents owned a bar in Buttevant in County Cork, and it was a country pub. And I remember when I'd be working in the pub, the customers would come in and they'd say, "Will you be a nurse or a teacher?" Right? Those were my two choices. And I was like, neither. I don't want to be either of those, And I ended up becoming a teacher. So it just shows the impact of what people's expectations can be on young people. And I would say don't impose any expectations on anyone, because our young people will be doing jobs that we don't even know what they are yet. We can't imagine what the future of work holds for our young people. So I kind of fell into teaching, Kevin, because a good friend of mine was teaching English in Madrid. And I had come back from the States. I was kind of looking around, thinking about going back to college. But you know what? I still had a lot of wanderlust in me. And she was in Madrid and she said, "Claire, there's so much work here teaching English because Barcelona was getting ready for the 92 Olympics. Sevilla was getting ready for the 92 Expo. And the city of Madrid was getting ready to be the city of culture in 92. So everyone in Spain apparently wanted to learn English. So I went out there in 1990 and I stayed for 2 years teaching English in Madrid. And then I moved down to Cordoba and taught English down there as well. And then I came back to UCC and finished my degree and became a teacher of Spanish. So the working environment was fantastic because I loved my subject. I loved teaching. I got into teaching because I am very passionate about my subjects. And but obviously there were difficulties as well. And I suppose with my diagnosis of sight loss, I mean, everyone's experience of sight loss is so unique and so different. For me, I suppose it really didn't start deteriorating until my 30s. I needed to use low vision aids during my 20s, but I wasn't. It wasn't that difficult because my Stargardts diagnosis, what it is it's progressive and degenerative, so it gets worse with age. And I suppose the best piece of advice I got from an ophthalmologist was, any stress will make any condition worse. So I've always really managed my stress levels, etc. And I suppose my motto in life is the secret of a long life is knowing when it's time to go. If something doesn't suit me anymore, then, shape up and ship out. So that really helps me maintain my stress levels and my own happiness, which I think is key. It's very important to this short life that we're given here on this planet. So yeah, working was, when it started getting difficult for me really was when in a large group of students I couldn't see what was happening in the classroom. You know, like I was teaching in further education, and so the good part of that is that I was working with adults, but you know, if there was somebody on the phone at the back of the class, like, it would take me a while to detect that. Now, I'm the kind of teacher who would walk around the classroom a lot so that I can see what's going on, because, you know, you have to have good classroom management, as well as having good knowledge of your topic. So that was difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, and that must have been quite a struggle, because as you say, and I hear it in your voice, you were really enjoyed teaching, and did that get you down, not being able to maybe do it as well as you once were?
Absolutely. Yeah, that definitely had an impact on my mental health. As I said, I think I've struggled throughout my life with the identity of, you know, having something in my life that I didn't want, that I didn't ask for, and that, I suppose, precluded me from participating in things that I would have liked to have done. I suppose I would have seen my career progression going in a different direction than what it was, but I felt, I suppose, with vision impairment, that I wouldn't always be selected or given the challenging roles that would allow you maybe to progress in your career. So yeah, it can be hard. So I that would be something to be aware of for people, to ensure that your vision loss isn't standing in the way of your career progression.
Very
And that's a
much.
hard one, Kevin. It's a hard one.
It is indeed, because none of us know exactly when we start our career how it's going to go, or how that career is going to be shaped by external factors and so on. And we fast forward now, Claire, to Inclusive Cork, your own business. You decided to take control yourself. Tell us more.
Well, I suppose I always liked the idea of having my own business. I worked in the public service for nearly 30 years in varying roles, from secondary school teaching to further education to third level. I used to teach in UCC the Spanish methodology for teachers, so teacher training. And so I've had a very varied role in education and thoroughly enjoyed every part of these roles. But I suppose there was always something in me, having been reared in a family business like a pub. I always thought I'd like to have my own business as well, and I had my own vision of what education is. And I've always worked with students. When you have a class of 25 or 30 students, like, you're always going to have disability or neurodiversity or mental health issues. And I had some incredible students who were excellent in the classroom, but when they'd go for work placements or for jobs, you know, you'd meet them in Cork, you'd be walking down Patrick Street and you'd meet an excellent past student, and you'd ask, what are you doing? And they'd be like, unemployed. And I just saw this massive gap between what we're doing in education, where disability is succeeding in education, it wasn't succeeding in the workplace. And there are fantastic organisations like AHEAD in Dublin, the Association for Higher Education and Access for Disability. They're doing incredible work for work placements and work experience. But we need more. We need more of that. And I felt there was a gap in knowledge of what disability is in the 21st century now, and what people can do. And I really go back to, I suppose, the people that are in power, the people that are the managers in the organizations are probably from Gen X and baby boomers, and they don't always have a positive narrative around what disability is, whereas younger people have been educated in an inclusive system and they know what technologies work for them and they can do the jobs. And I think this remote working situation is just showing how well disabled people can do their jobs when they're working from home as well. And that's why I set up Inclusive Cork. So Inclusive Cork, what we do is disability awareness training for businesses.
And how's that going for you? Lots of interest in it, and lots of offers of work, and I think it's a topic that employers really should be engaging with. And do you think there's a genuine interest on behalf of employers to learn more about disability in the 21st century?
Kevin, there is definitely a genuine interest. I think a lot of companies, and I will say that I believe the catalyst is the millennials, and I really want to thank Gen Y, the millennials, for getting the conversation going on what we call D&I. It's diversity and inclusion, and it is diversity and inclusion in every intersectionality, whether it's gender or sexual orientation, religion, race, marital status, and disability, or membership of the traveller community. So because they have come from inclusive educational settings, they want to work in organizations and companies that are also diverse and inclusive. And disability is just one of those intersectionalities. So there is a huge interest, but I also believe, and what I feel from going into organizations, there is still a huge fear around disability. As you know, even the language around disability is evolving, it's changing, and people want to be politically correct. They don't want to offend, but they still, because one group of people may identify as disabled, another group of people who society might say are disabled, for example, the deaf community, and when I say deaf, I mean with a capital D, they might describe themselves as a cultural minority. So I suppose for businesses, when it starts getting complex, they get scared. And so when people are scared, as you know, it can cause paralysis and it can cause inertia, and then they do nothing around the topic. And I think that's why disability employment is so far behind that it should be.
Yeah, that's very true. And the old adage, if in doubt, leave it out, probably kicks in for a lot of employers and people in management roles, which is very unfortunate. But I suppose something that I have BMI bonnet about, and I'd be curious to see your thoughts and impressions of this, is that the government as a whole have made lots of supports for employers available, but from speaking to people, particularly who are blind and vision impaired in my current role, when they go for interviews and so on and so forth, a lot of employers are not aware of the state supports for hiring somebody with a disability. So I think the government is doing good work in one sense in terms of putting the schemes and initiatives in place, but they're failing to promote that adequately through IDA, Enterprise Ireland, or even the government departments themselves.
I totally agree. And I mean, the government are doing what their job is. You know, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that's their job as government officials to bring in the supports for marginalised groups, one of those marginalised groups being people with disabilities. But it's exactly what I hear as well on the ground. When I tell employers about the grants and supports that are available to them, it's like it's their very first time ever hearing them. Now, I have been in touch with the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection here in Cork, and they would say that they're blue in the face from telling employers about all the supports that are available for them to employ disability. But the message isn't getting through. But as we can see, you know, even in our current situation, messaging and communicating, it's so important. And the way we communicate and get messages across, if you just have something on a website, people aren't going to search it out. You know, it has to be communicated in many different formats for people to be able to hear it. I do a lot of work when I go into organizations about what kind of learner you are. You know, do you need to see a picture? Do you need to hear it? Are you physical? Do you need to be able to just work through it? Are you mathical? Are you logical? Do you need to work in small groups to learn something? Like, so there's so much around how people learn or how people receive messaging and communicating. And, you know, it's a huge topic, but I agree completely. The supports are there in society, but navigating the supports, Kevin, I've written an article on LinkedIn and I called it Navigating the Disability Quagmire, because it is a quagmire trying to navigate the support.
It certainly is. It's somewhat complex as well, and people do struggle with it. And I suppose just before we wrap up today, there are lots of challenges for people with disabilities at this particular time arising from COVID. But looking back at previous economic crashes and problems that we've had in Ireland, a group that has suffered a lot as a result of downturns, and we look back at the last recession, is people with disabilities, and our employment rate in Ireland and across Europe is quite low for people with a disability. So it's very important that the government continue to do their job, but employers also remember to support their disabled staff that they do have in roles, so that they don't get caught in poverty traps with reduced hours or the loss of roles as well.
Absolutely. And I always say that, disability is a societal issue, and the government can play their part and charities can play their part, but we need business to play their part. It is very important that businesses recognize us as employees, as customers, and as users of their services and goods. And there are 1.3 billion people around the world with disabilities. So look at the value of disability, not just see it as something for sympathy or tragedy, but see us as your employees and consumers.
Claire, this is your opportunity to plug Inclusive Cork. So if there's anyone listening to the podcast who would like to get in touch with yourself or to learn more about Inclusive Cork, how can they do that?
Oh, thank you, Kevin. Well, I have a website, so it's inclusivecork.ie. I suppose I'm on every social platform, but I probably do best on LinkedIn, but I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, so anyone can contact me through those social platforms as well. I do a podcast called the Disrupt Ability Podcast. And the podcast is an educational and information platform for all stakeholders in disability. So I have interviewed other blind people like Cara Gibbons, psychotherapist from Galway, but I interview all people with disabilities who have successfully navigated education and employment, and they tell their stories of how they get there. And I suppose what we're doing is we're leaving paper trails for the younger generation. Because you asked me earlier, like, what would I have liked to, like when I was younger, what would my younger self have liked to have had? And so I'm trying to create what my younger self would have liked to have had: podcast information, accessible information, so then I can decide where I want to go with my disability. So definitely check out the Disruptability podcast. And that is on Spotify, iTunes, and it's also on YouTube, and I have it all captioned. And finally, I suppose I can do a little bit of a soft launch here as well. My new school is opening. And as you said, are there opportunities with this new remote situation? I called myself Inclusive Cork because I thought I'd be doing all my training in Cork because I use public transport. And I thought, oh, it's going to be hard to get everywhere else in Ireland. I'll just concentrate on Cork because we do have a lot of big companies here. But now everything is remote. So my new school is going to be opening, and it's called Inclusive World Training. And there will be training modules for companies around disability awareness. But I am also going to be launching products for disabled people working and not working or looking for work. So there'll be all kinds of classes for all kinds of people. It's going to be inclusive and accessible for everyone. So that'll be coming shortly in the next few weeks. Inclusive World Training.
Fantastic, Claire. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you this morning, and I'm sure your podcast will become people's second favorite podcast behind the NCBI podcast. But really delightful to speak to you. Lots going on, and we'll keep in touch with you over the next few months to see how your various initiatives are going.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. It was an absolute pleasure.
That was Clare Kennelly, the CEO of Inclusive Cork, speaking to me, Kevin Kelly, about all things employment, her sight loss journey, and her podcast. Lots of interesting content and ideas and initiatives. And of course, if you are someone who is blind or vision impaired and you are struggling with any aspect of employment, don't hesitate to get in contact with NCBI's employment service. Probably the easiest way to do that is to call our info line 1850 33 43 53. Until next time, stay safe and we'll talk to you again soon.